Today we're continuing with Daniel chapter 6, part 2, and I've titled this teaching, A Foreshadow of the Messiah. Now, in the beginning of Daniel chapter 6, we saw how it is written about Daniel that he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And this phrase in Aramaic is Ruach Yatira, and it means an extraordinary or an excellent spirit. As we continue in Daniel chapter 6, part 2 today, I want us to be thinking about the question, how does the life of Daniel foreshadow the life of the Messiah? And as we go into the continued chapter of Daniel 6, we remember that in the new administration of the Medo-Persian Empire, the Daniel was an official, and the other officials were looking to trap Daniel and to get rid of him, really. And this is where we continue in Daniel chapter 6, verse 6. And we read, "Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. Now, when these officials came to King Darius, we read how they, quote unquote, came by agreement. But a more accurate translation would be that they came tumultuously. Now, the Aramaic word for this English phrase is hargishu, and literally means to gather in a tumultuous manner. Now, the word tumultuous means excited, confused, or disorderly. The Hebrew word regesh means feeling or emotion, and is clearly and closely related to this Aramaic word. This Aramaic word here, gishu, is only used 3 times in the Bible, and all 3 times are found here in Daniel 6, verses 6, 11, and 15. Each time it is used of these men who eagerly sought the destruction of the life of Daniel. There's a spiritual intensity that comes from those who do evil, those who seek to kill, steal, and destroy. Evil men and women will do anything in their power in order to destroy the righteous. We saw this same evil technique in Daniel chapter 3 when certain men sought to have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego destroyed for not bowing down to the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Evil men are not concerned with the law, but rather they are hell-bent, meaning determined or single-minded on destroying those who walk with God in righteousness. We must understand the tactics of evil men. We see these tactics clearly laid out in Daniel chapter 6. Number 1, they were well-spoken and used the proper language before the king. King Darius lived forever. Now, this is a regular greeting, but of course they don't want to offend the king, and they approached him in the right manner. Number 2, they lied and made it seem like all of the high officials were in agreement. As we read, all the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together. However, we know that at least one high official was not included, and that was Daniel. Number 3, they made a new law that was particularly targeted against a servant of God, saying, the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Number 4, they flattered the king by making him feel honored as a god in order to distract from their evil plan, putting King Darius in a place of being prayed to as a god. Number 5, they had the king sign the document in haste so as to not miss their opportunity to accomplish this evil. As we read in the text, it says, "Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed." The face of evil may look different in different countries, cultures, and time periods, but the tactics of the evil one and those who practice evil are always the same. We read in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. As we read in these verses, we need to be on the alert. We need to be on our guard against the ways of the enemy. Why did the men who conspired against Daniel limit this new law to only 1 month, 30 days? Why did they not make it a permanent statute which would continue for the life of the king? Now, that's not written in the text, so we have to speculate. And my own opinion is, number one, they probably had their own gods to whom they wanted to worship and pray, so they didn't want to totally exclude themselves from praying to their gods again. So this made it for a short time. Number two, they knew that they only needed a short window of time to catch Daniel praying to his God because Daniel lived a consistent life. So King Darius signed the document and made it a law. And then we read the following. Now, when Daniel knew the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Daniel knew about the new law, but did not change his practice in praying 3 times a day. So why did Daniel pray 3 times a day? Was he following some biblical command? It is never commanded to pray 3 times a day in the scriptures. However, somewhere along the way, it became a practice in Judaism. When I say Judaism, I mean in Israeli society, going back, way back in history. Now, most Jewish traditions started in the Babylonian exile. However, it may have been established before the exile, as evidence in this Psalm of David, which says, David says, as for me, I shall call upon God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon, I will complain and murmur, and he will hear my voice. Psalm 55, 16 and 17. Now, King David lived 400 years before the exile. So we see this pattern of praying 3 times a day, even back in King David's time. We also know that praying toward Jerusalem was established in the days of King Solomon, as we read here in 2 Chronicles chapter 6. Quote, when they sin against you, this is a prayer of King Solomon, right? So he's talking to the Lord. When they sin against you, for there is no man who does not sin, and you are angry with them and deliver them to an enemy, so that they take them captive to a land far off or near. If they take thought in the land where they are taken captive and repent and make supplication to you in the land of their captivity, saying, we have sinned, we have committed iniquity and have acted wickedly. If they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their captivity, where they have been taken captive, and pray toward their land, which you have given to their fathers, and the city which you have chosen, and toward the house which I have built for your name, then hear from heaven, from your dwelling place, their prayer and supplications, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you. Daniel obeyed the scriptures when he prayed towards Jerusalem, the city where God placed his name. He was literally living out what was commanded, or what King Solomon had prayed 400 years earlier. The practice of praying 3 times a day became a more codified observation during the time of the Babylonian exile. As a result of being removed from the land of Israel, and after the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people sought to maintain an active spiritual life while in exile. The prayers of praying 3 times a day replaced the temple activity of the sacrifices and the offerings. This same practice of praying 3 times a day continues in Jewish practice up until today. As we continue in Daniel chapter 6, verse 11, we read, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Quote, Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition for any god, to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. And as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Twice more in the verses we just read, in verses 11 and 15, we read the Aramaic word hargishu, to gather in a tumultuous manner, right, with much emotion and disorder. The aggressive manner in which these men rushed together to catch Daniel praying to someone other than the king and to bring Daniel's violation before the king, again, reveals their evil heart. We also see the qualifying statement, quote, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, in these 2 verses. Once it was by the king, just confirming that this is how it is done. The other time was by these men. Why did these men continually repeat the conditions of the law as the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked? First of all, these officials knew that the king was pleased with Daniel's service in the kingdom and that the king planned on promoting Daniel to be the chief ruler. As a result of this, these men wanted a fail-proof system by which to condemn Daniel, which was having the king institute a law guaranteed by the Medes and Persians. To understand the implications of laws made at that time and according to their culture, I will quote from a commentary written on the book of Daniel by Dr. Showers on Medo-Persian law. And I read this from Dr. Showers, quote, for it was a proud boast of Persia that its laws never changed, and that a royal promise or decree was irrevocable. In his edicts and judgments, the king was supposed to be inspired by the god Ahura Mazda himself. Therefore, the law of the realm was the divine will, and any infraction of it was an offense against the deity. We also see confirmation of the practice of the law of the Medes and Persians in the book of Esther. In Esther 1:19, it says this, if it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. So a law made in the Medo-Persian Empire was binding and could not be revoked. It could not be canceled. Therefore, King Darius was unable to change the very law which he himself had made. Now, the labeling of Daniel by these men as, quote, one of the exiles from Judah was again more than likely used as a means to make Daniel stand out as a foreigner, one who does not honor the local practices in Babylon. This labeling of Daniel as an exile from Judah was probably also stated to classify him as part of a rebellious people that was brought to Babylon in slavery. King Darius obviously came to understand that these men had trapped him by having him sign this law without realizing its implications, and he was deeply grieved as a result. He then tried to find a way to deliver Daniel from this death penalty, but was not able to reverse his own law. It was then that King Darius carried out the order to throw him into the den of lions. But at that time, he also spoke a word of hope. And we read, then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles. so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Now the king reassured Daniel that his God would deliver him. Did King Darius really believe in the power of Daniel's God? King Darius's subsequent actions seem to confirm that he had some faith. As we read, then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting. How did King Darius spend his time fasting? Did he pray toward Jerusalem as Daniel prayed? That would have been quite ironic, since that's why Daniel was in the lion's den. Now we have to remember that all natural doors to Daniel's deliverance were shut and sealed as a stone was placed over the opening of the lion's den. The stone was sealed with the signet ring of the king and the signet rings of his nobles. So who were the nobles with the signet rings, which also sealed the stone den of the lions? These nobles who sealed the stone with their rings were possibly the other officials who brought the charges against Daniel. In the eyes of the world, Daniel was dead. There was no human possibility of Daniel escaping or being delivered. The nobles probably returned to the city that night and had a party to celebrate the death of their enemy. In contrast to the joy of these wicked men, King Darius spent the evening in fasting. Why did those men hate Daniel to the point of orchestrating his death? Daniel was a threat to their power in the kingdom. If Daniel was a lowly servant, those men would never have noticed who he was. Daniel was one of the top 3 officials in the kingdom, and King Darius planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. The other officials were jealous of Daniel's position and power in the kingdom, and therefore they did everything in their power to terminate his life. Daniel lived his life in full integrity, and his life was a constant mirror to his fellow officials that there is another God, the God of the Hebrews. Daniel's righteous life was a constant source of agitation to them. The life of Daniel foreshadowed the life of Messiah in numerous ways, including the manner in which he was accused, arrested, condemned, and delivered. So now we want to take some time and consider some of the ways in which the life of Daniel foreshadows the life of the Messiah. Number 1, power, jealousy, and hate motivated those men to do what they did to Daniel. And are these not the same reasons that they plotted against and killed the Messiah? In the Gospel of John, we read the following in John 11. Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, "What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Power and authority are difficult to let go of once people obtain it. The religious leaders in Yeshua's day saw Yeshua as a threat to their power and authority as they worked under the Roman authority. Therefore, they planned to kill Yeshua in order to remove the threat that he posed to their power and position, just like the men did to Daniel. Number 2, Daniel was betrayed by his fellow officials when he was praying at his regular place of prayer. As we read in Daniel 6:11, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Yeshua was betrayed by Judas, who led the mob to him while he was praying in the garden, as we read in the Gospels. And I'll read several different verses from the Gospels here. When Yeshua had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden in which he entered with his disciples. They came to a place named Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here until I have prayed." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be very distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch." And he went a little beyond them and fell to the ground and began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. Now, Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Yeshua had often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Daniel was betrayed and condemned to death for praying at his regular place of prayer to the God in heaven. Yeshua was betrayed and arrested while he was praying at his regular place of prayer to his Father in heaven. Number 3, Daniel's place of death was covered with a stone and sealed with authority to protect and secure his place of death. As we read in verse 17, a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Yeshua's place of death and burial was secured in a similar manner. The religious leaders who orchestrated the death of Yeshua wanted to guarantee his death without any possibility of escape or deliverance, as we read in Matthew chapter 27. Now, on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days, I am to rise again.' Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples will come and steal him away and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' And the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go and make it as secure as you know how." And they went and made the grave secure. And along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. The jealousy and hatred of the religious authorities against Yeshua was so intense that they could not even bear to think about what would happen if he actually rose from the dead or if his body was removed from the tomb. Ironically, in both situations, the greatest fear of the enemies of Yeshua and Daniel came true. The sealed stones were unable to keep them in the ground. They were both brought back to the land of the living. As we read in Daniel 6, verses 19 to 22, then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime." Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So we read how the king went early in the morning to see if God had delivered Daniel from death. Daniel was alive and declared how God had sent his angel to deliver him from the lions. Daniel was taken out of the lion's den and restored to the land of the living. The enemies of Daniel were condemned and thrown to the lions for their vile actions. There are several parallels to the resurrection of Yeshua, as we read in Luke 24. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb bringing the spices which they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Yeshua. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling clothing. And as the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. Number 4, those who loved and followed Yeshua came early in the morning at the break of day, just like King Darius, to care for his body. Number 5, angels were sent to the tomb to minister to God's people. And number 6, the stone was rolled away and Yeshua was declared to have been raised from the dead. Now, although Daniel was not killed, his life is a testimony to the power of God over death and the enemy. The death and resurrection of Yeshua serve to remind us of our own future resurrection. As we read in 1 Corinthians 15, 22 to 26, for as in Adam all die, so also in Messiah all will be made alive, but each in his own order. Messiah, the first fruits, after that, those who are Messiahs at his coming. Then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom to God, to the God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death. Those who hate God will also hate those who testify to his name. The enemies of God believe that by killing his followers, they will eradicate God from the earth. But they forget what Yeshua has spoken. In Matthew 10:28, do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. They may kill our bodies, but they cannot kill our souls. We fear God and not man because Yeshua has overcome death. The manner in which King Darius fasted on the evening when Daniel was cast into the lion's den, and then went first thing to the lion's den to check if Daniel was still alive, is evidence that the king really did have some hope or faith that Daniel could be saved from this unjustified death sentence. The king cried out to Daniel by calling him a servant of the living God, which is also a telling sign that King Darius saw a living faith in the life of Daniel. Whether or not King Darius really believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a matter to be debated. However, the king acknowledged the living testimony of Daniel's God. Daniel testified that God sent his angel and closed the mouths of the lions, proving that he was innocent before God and the king. He also stated that no injury was found on him. This is similar to the outcome of Daniel's 3 friends when they came out of the fiery furnace with no trace of smoke on their clothing. In both situations, it was a demonstration of God's supernatural power. After this dramatic deliverance of Daniel from the lion's den by the power of God, King Darius testified publicly, as we read in the last few verses of Daniel chapter 6. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who are living in all the lands. May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. King Darius declared to all the people under his authority, number 1, to fear the God of Daniel, the living God who endures forever, and number 2, that his kingdom will never be destroyed and that his rule will continue until the end. Whatever King Darius actually believed in his heart, we see that he feared the God of heaven and recognized his rightful place under God's authority. The kingdom belongs to the Lord. King Darius understood this and honored Daniel, God's servant, when others tried to kill him. Evil men always fight against the righteous because those who are counted as righteous represent God's presence on earth. Evil men do not want to think about God and they reject God's commandments. Therefore, they are constantly trying to destroy anything or anyone who represents who God is. Yeshua warned his disciples regarding the hatred of the enemy. We read this in John 15. If the world hates you, you know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this, the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know the one who sent me. There were those in Babylon who hated Daniel and tried to destroy him only because of his faith in the God of heaven. The prophet Daniel's life foreshadowed the life of Messiah in many ways, including how the kingdom of God was proclaimed to the world by a secular king. This brings an end to this teaching on Daniel chapter 6, a foreshadow of the Messiah. I want to thank you for being part of this teaching, and I want to encourage you, if you are benefiting, please support this ministry so that we can continue to teach God's word from the Jewish, cultural, historical, and linguistic perspective. Thank you, and see you again next time.